Hey everyone, welcome back to our final session going through the book of Genesis and particularly looking at the Joseph story together. As a short recap of our previous two sessions about Joseph, we have seen dramatic changes in both Judah and Joseph. Judah's character has changed from an older brother willing to sell his younger brother into slavery, and from an immoral, pagan-like father who lived among the Canaanites, but finally recognizes his unrighteousness, to now being the clear leader of the brothers, willing to sacrifice of himself as a substitute for the sake of the family. Their father listens to his suggestion over Reuben, the eldest brother's suggestion. Joseph has changed as well. He began the story as a naughty younger brother who became an Egyptian slave and prisoner under the Lord's blessing, and then became an Egyptian lord who rules all of Egypt and hatches a clever plan to kidnap his youngest brother from the family while leaving the rest of them in Canaan. Finally, after Judah offers himself for the sake of his father and brother, Joseph breaks down, reveals himself to the brothers, and he and the Pharaoh pledge to care for the family, but not in the promised land. They will provide for them in Egypt. These are not simple characters. This is not a simple story. You can't just say, Jacob is bad, Joseph is good, Judah is bad. It is so complex, and that's what makes it fun. This is God's Word. Now, there are two things to consider about where this leaves our story. First, we need to ask whether the family is truly reconciled after Joseph reveals himself. Joseph seems to have forgiven his brothers and promised to provide for them. But we will see in Genesis 50 that they still fear him. True reconciliation, I believe, remains on the distant horizon. Second, we need to consider why Jacob and the family might fear Egypt. Jacob's grandfather, Abraham, had gone down to Egypt during a famine. Sound familiar? But he was cast out of Egypt after the Lord brought plagues upon Pharaoh's house. When Isaac faced a similar famine, a similar situation to his father, the Lord directly told Isaac, "Do not go down to Egypt." Furthermore, Egypt is the land that has treated them harshly during the past few years, even if they know that the harsh treatment was from their brother Joseph. Egypt would not have been a promised land in their minds, but a place that they feared, and that's where our story begins. Genesis 46 verses 1 through to 4 often gets left out whenever people summarize this story in the Bible. It never mentions Joseph. Well, it only mentions Joseph briefly in the final verse. But I would contend this is one of the most significant sections in the entire story. You see, this is the only time in all of Genesis 37 to 50 when God speaks directly. He doesn't speak to Judah. He doesn't speak to Joseph. He speaks to their father, Jacob, to the last of the patriarchs. The Abrahamic covenant had been passed down from Abraham to Isaac and then to Jacob. And it is Jacob to whom God speaks here. God calls to Jacob using his name twice, Jacob, Jacob, in a way that alludes to God's call to Abraham after he nearly sacrificed Isaac. The Lord assures Jacob not to fear Egypt. The Lord will make the Israelites into a great nation in Egypt. The Lord says that he will go down with them and he will bring them back. In other words, what happens in Egypt will not be the end of the story. They will reside here for a while, at least long enough to become a great nation. But their future lies beyond Egypt and back in the Promised Land. Thus, we can expect a truly Israelite perspective to look forward beyond their time in Egypt. This contrast between a future in the Promised Land and their current situation in Egypt dominates the final chapters of the book. Well, Jacob and the family go down to Egypt. They bring all that they own. Nobody stays behind. Nothing is left. The entire family, 70 in all, come down to Egypt. The central portion of Genesis 46 is a genealogy. I love genealogies in the Bible. Do you love genealogies? Genealogies are great. It names all the 70 who came to Egypt. All 12 tribes went down into Egypt. Many of Jacob's sons, it says, now have their own sons and even grandchildren. Notice that the genealogy includes Joseph and his children, even though they had already come to Egypt. In fact, the two children, Ephraim and Manasseh, were born in Egypt. They had never been in the Promised Land. But once again, it also emphasizes that they are the grandchildren of an Egyptian priest, Potiphar, priest of On. Never forget. One wonders, by the inclusion of that phrase about their grandfather, if they are truly considered part of the family. Well, we will see in Genesis 48 how Jacob resolves that question. Genesis 46 ends with Jacob's arrival in Egypt. He sends Judah ahead of them as the family representative. Isn't it interesting? Judah has fully taken Reuben's place as the leader of the brothers. Jacob rejoices at seeing his long-lost son, Joseph. They weep together. But before the family meets the Pharaoh, Joseph prepares them for the conversation. This is important. He doesn't want them to mess things up. He tells them exactly how to address Pharaoh to have them placed in the land of Goshen. This is Joseph's strategy. Have them be in the pasture lands of Goshen while Egypt stays elsewhere. You see, Goshen was the best of the pasture lands, and it wasn't occupied by Egyptians because Egyptians despised shepherds. Well, things don't go exactly as Joseph had instructed them in the beginning of Genesis 47. The brothers had been told to tell Pharaoh only that they raise livestock because shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Don't mention that they are shepherds. But when asked, they never mention livestock, and they immediately say that they are shepherds, just like their ancestors. They note that there is no pasture land for their animals and ask Pharaoh to settle them in Goshen. That's a little blunt to just ask the Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the world at the time, hey, can we have this really good pasture land? Well, they are much more brazen than Joseph had instructed them to be, but Pharaoh graciously gives them what they ask. And this is one of my favorite points. At this point in the story, Joseph brings his elderly father Jacob before Pharaoh. Imagine the scene. The family are destitute and have come to Egypt because they can't even provide for themselves. They need food to survive. They are from no famous family. They have no political power. They have no economic power. In fact, it is Pharaoh who has all the power. He's one of the most powerful persons in the world, and his power has only grown during the famine as everyone is coming to him for assistance. The Pharaoh has armies, cities, produce, and the only surviving economy. Yet when Jacob comes into the room, Jacob blesses Pharaoh. This is an utterly audacious thing to do. The greater always blesses the lesser. In the eyes of the world, Pharaoh is certainly greater. But Jacob knows more than Pharaoh does. Jacob knows that the God of the universe has a covenant with his family. It may not look like it, but Pharaoh truly needs Jacob's blessing. In fact, the covenant with Abraham had promised that all of the families of the earth will be blessed through Abraham's descendants. And here, Abraham's descendant Jacob blesses the king of Egypt. After the family settles in Goshen, the narrative shifts to discuss Joseph's administration of Egypt during the famine. Remember that Joseph had stored grain from the abundance of Egypt's farmers during 7 years of abundance. He then sold it back to the Egyptian farmers for a cost. This had been summarized briefly in Genesis 41, but the narrator waits until Genesis 47 to give us a close-up view of how it happened. This section, Genesis 47 verses 13 through to 26, progresses in intensity. First, Joseph sells grain to the Egyptian people in exchange for their silver, for their money. But the people quickly run out of all their money. What type of rates is Joseph charging? He stores all of the money in Pharaoh's palace. After he takes their money in exchange for food, they sell to Joseph all of their livestock. To survive, the Egyptians are forced to sell their sheep, cattle, and donkeys to Pharaoh and to Joseph. But the people continue to starve. They've given up all of their money, all of their livestock, and they're still starving. They still need food. And so it is in this situation that as the famine lingers, they offer their land and even their own freedom for survival. Joseph had experienced slavery to Pharaoh in Egypt and had referred to his slavery as living in a pit. He had pled for Pharaoh to free him. But in response to the continued famine, Joseph took all of the people's lands and made them all slaves. It uses the same Hebrew word, slave, as had been described of Joseph. He made them all slaves to Pharaoh. This empowers Pharaoh all the more. He now owns all of Egypt's land, money, livestock, and even its people. Joseph also doesn't take land from the pagan priests. Isn't that interesting that the narrative tells us this? After all, that is his wife's family. So at the end of this story, there are two groups of people who are more powerful: Pharaoh and the pagan priests. They now have the money, the livestock, the land, and even the people as servants. Now, the ancient rabbis struggled to interpret this section of the story because this is the very slavery that empowered Pharaoh to eventually enslave the Israelites after Joseph was forgotten. It's also very strikingly similar language to a passage that later portrays Solomon in a poor light as Solomon builds the temple. It's unclear how we should think of Joseph in this episode. Israel thrives in Goshen, while everyone else survives but suffers. Is Joseph a wise administrator, as some, like Gerhard von Rott, interpret this story? Or has Joseph the victim now become a victimizer, as others, like Fo Yong Wing, interpret this story? I'll leave it for you to think through. Moving ahead to Genesis 48 and 49, we have a series of blessings. From the end of Genesis 47 to the end of the book, the focus is no longer on the larger issues in Egypt, but now the focus is on the Israelite family. Chapter 47 ends with Jacob making Joseph swear to not bury him in Egypt. He wants a proper burial with his ancestors in the Promised Land. This subtle reminder emphasizes that Israel will eventually return to the Promised Land. God's promises have not come to an end. Now, at a later point, Genesis 48 tells us that Joseph brings his children to Jacob. Jacob is old. Jacob knows that his days are few, so he recounts God's covenant to Joseph. Make sure that Joseph hears it once again. God has promised him many descendants and that many nations would come from his offspring. Furthermore, Jacob reiterates that the Promised Land was given to them as a permanent possession. At this point, Jacob settles the issue of Joseph's children. Even though they had been born in Egypt, even though they are the grandchildren of a pagan priest, Jacob says, Ephraim and Manasseh belong to me just as Reuben and Simeon do. He claims these children as his own. What an amazing thing to do. What a way to show God's blessing to all the nations. And if you remember the 12 tribes of Israel, there is no tribe of Joseph, but 2 tribes belong to Joseph, those of Ephraim and Manasseh, his 2 half-Egyptian children. Interestingly, Jacob does not recognize Joseph's children. He asks for them to come to him for a blessing. He is old, his eyesight is poor, but this is not like whenever he tricked his father Isaac. Isaac was also old, his eyesight was poor, but here Jacob knows what he's doing. He crosses his hands to bless Ephraim and Manasseh, in fact, blessing Ephraim, the secondborn, before Manasseh, the firstborn, despite their birth order. When Joseph tries to stop him, Jacob lets him know that he knows what he's doing. He says, I know, my son. He blesses them with the blessings of Abraham and Isaac, but specifically says, quote, may they grow to be numerous within the land, end quote. Though they are grandchildren of an Egyptian pagan priest, their future will be in the Promised Land. It is in the Promised Land where they will become numerous. Now, throughout these final chapters, there is a contrast. On the one hand, the Israelites are certainly blessed by Pharaoh and Joseph in Egypt. But on the other hand, their future blessing is not in Egypt, but back in the Promised Land. Jacob even promises a plot of land to Joseph. Joseph has the best of Egypt. Joseph has whatever he wants. But Jacob gives him an inheritance, not in Egypt, in the Promised Land. Genesis 49 is a great chapter. It recounts Jacob's final blessings to all of his sons. Much could be said about this chapter and these blessings, but there are 2 particular things that I want to emphasize. First, most of the blessings look to a future life back in the Promised Land. See the theme? Second, Judah's blessings stand above the blessings of the other brothers. If you remember, Joseph had had dreams about all of the brothers bowing before him, and they did. But Jacob promises that all of these sons will ultimately bow before Judah. The royal line, the scepter, will come through Judah and will not depart from him. This came to reality whenever Samuel anointed King David over Israel hundreds of years later. Solomon, the son of David, and all of the kings of the southern kingdom came from Judah. And that brings us to the last chapter of Genesis. Genesis 50 gives us the longest burial account in the entire Old Testament. More emphasis is given to Jacob's death and burial than any other figure in the Old Testament. The interplay between how the Egyptians and the Israelites relate to Jacob's death is interesting. One wonders if this great patriarch, how he might have responded were he to know that he would be mummified and placed in a casket or in a coffin in Egypt. However, as the processional takes him back to the promised land to bury him in the place of his ancestors, just like he had made Joseph swear to him, it's interesting that the peoples of the land see the procession and assume that they are Egyptians. It's this strange back and forth between Egypt and Israel in this final scene. Will the future of the Israelites be in Egypt, or will it be in the promised land? Well, the processional takes him back to the ancestral burial grounds at the cave Abraham had purchased. Jacob's corpse will reside in the promised land. In a strange way, his burial looks forward to a future hope outside of Egypt and back home in the promised land. Well, after Jacob's burial, the brothers once again fear that Joseph will now make them suffer. Maybe it was Jacob that was holding things together. They haven't truly reconciled. But things change in chapter 50. Joseph gives them one of the most famous statements in the book. He says, quote, "You planned evil against me. God planned it for good," end quote. He comforts his brothers. He speaks kindly to them. Remember in Genesis 37, the brothers could not speak a peaceful word to Joseph. Well, here, Joseph speaks kindly to them. Isn't it interesting that many sermon series end at this point with this famous phrase about, what you meant for evil, God meant for good? That's absolutely true. God has a sovereign plan to care for his people. But that's not the end of the book. And what happens next is even more important than what Joseph has said. You see, Joseph's final words, which come after a long time as he is preparing for his death, his final words are, quote, "I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land he swore to give, or to the land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He made the children of Israel swear, when God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here." Joseph had experienced the sufferings of Egypt. Joseph had been a slave. Joseph had been imprisoned. But Joseph had experienced the power of Egypt and all of Egypt's blessings. He had provided for his family by bringing them out of the promised land and into Egypt. He had brought them under Pharaoh's care. But despite being the second most powerful person in Egypt, in his final words, Joseph looks to a future in the promised land. God will be faithful to his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God will restore his people to the promised land. And as a sign, when they are delivered, they will bring his Egyptian coffin with them. Sure enough, in Exodus 13, verse 19, we read that Moses brought up Joseph's bones with him during the Exodus. And in Joshua 24, verse 32, we read that Joseph's bones were buried in Shechem after the Israelites had returned to the promised land, at the place where Joshua made the covenant for the nation, or renewed the covenant for the nation. Well, that brings us to the end of the book. How should we think about the end of Genesis? Well, God has remained faithful to the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He has preserved his people, but they are not where they are supposed to be. They're growing and receiving God's blessings in some ways, but this blessing is coming outside of the promised land. Despite this, the final chapters give several indications that this will only be a temporary situation. God has promised Jacob that he would bring them up again. Jacob's blessings on Ephraim and Manasseh, as well as his blessings on all of his sons, look to future blessings back in the promised land. Even Joseph's final words look to the same future in the promised land. In this way, the book of Genesis comes to an end, but the story itself has not ended. Genesis looks beyond itself. God's story is not yet complete. God's people will one day return to the promised land. One day, God will raise up a king from Judah. And in those future days, just as at the time of Joseph, God will remain faithful. May God be faithful to your study of his word.